Thank you very much, Professor Kuru. Those were two really brilliant presentations. I think the first being a somewhat sober and cautionary message, and the second being somewhat more cautiously optimistic. And I guess it felt a little bit like watching a tennis match where, I mean, personally I wanted to go on and I wanted to end in a draw. The question I have, I guess, in response to what Professor Kuru provocatively asked, what is Turkish Islam? Well, the Turkish Republic has provided an answer for that since 1924 or so in the form of a presidency for religious affairs located in the Prime Minister's office, and this is one of the large and perhaps bloated bureaucracies of the state with as many as 100,000 employees. And so my question for both of you, just to start us off, is what is the fate of the Diyanet, this presidency for religious affairs, in the new republic? I know that one think tank close to the government has suggested that if it were to come to a time of constitutional reform, that the Diyanet would be looked at very closely, and that perhaps it would be targeted by this liberalizing trend of allowing for perhaps more freedoms for religious affairs, but therefore also less state involvement, less state guarantee of the very dividing line between religion and politics that you both spoke of. And this is, I think, the one way in which this has nothing to do with French assertive secularism, because French assertive secularism stopped having a constitutional clergy in the mid-19th century, whereas Turkey has continued to have the equivalent of a constitutional clergy. So I'd just like to have perhaps both of your views on that and then open up the discussion.
Okay, so you're asking about future prescriptive analysis. What happens to Diyanet in the future?
Given what you saw in Kazakhstan, for example, and the cooperation.
Well, okay, usually I really try not to do prescriptive analysis because as Huntington did some predictions, and we've been talking about them for 20 years, and I think you can always refute it because it's hard for us without putting people into the labs. It's hard for us to see the future, but let me give you my perspective on it without making prescriptive, without saying anything prescriptive about the future. When you look at the constitutional amendments today, I mean the ones that are already done, there has been a crisis over constitutional reform, and the advocates and the opponents of constitutional reform have debated everything except for the issue, the burning issue of freedoms and rights in Turkey. What I'm trying to say is, both the government and its opposition, so both the advocates of constitutional reform and the opponents of it, are more interested in undermining each other and attacking each other whenever it's possible by taking their liberties away, by jailing people from the other side. The discussions have not included anything specifically about expanding anybody's freedoms. There has been some discussion and some changes in the Constitution about affirmative action for the disabled and children, etc. That's the only exception. The rest of the Constitution amendments aimed at changing the balance of power relations within the Constitutional Court, within the military, here and there. It's a power struggle. Nobody cares about freedoms. So in that sense, if you're asking me if the constitutional reform next time is promising to make any change in terms of freedom of religion, what we have seen so far, the constitutional reform has almost nothing to do with expansion of freedoms and rights. This is sad because this is the product of 1980 military coup, and the constitution, as Ahmet's recent book clearly suggests, the constitution of Turkey is the weakest when it comes to individual freedoms and civil rights. Instead of protecting the citizens and citizens' freedoms, it's protecting the state from its citizens. Nothing has changed so far. I mean, all this fight between the advocates and opponents are about other things. Who's going to have more power? Who's going to control the court? Who's going to control the military? In that sense, I'm actually very pessimistic unless some attention is paid to this, and some international interference maybe from international community, which was attempted at some point. A collaboration between Columbia University and some constitutional experts was attempted, and then it was criticized as foreign intervention. Ahmet can tell you more about that. So I'm not very optimistic about this kind of change in the near future in Turkey.
Thank you.
Yes, I would like to thank to Berna for reminding me. I suggested passive secularist transformation in Turkey. In the newspaper Milliyet published my picture, and beneath it they wrote passive secularism from Ahmet Kuru made in USA. For them, which is an American conspiracy that somehow we are organizing things here and transferring to Turkey.
What do you think today is all about?
Yes, that's another conspiracy. Yes, excellent question from you about Diyanet. Thank you. And if I would like to touch briefly, starting with France. Until 1905, you are right that they had the Diyanet type relations between the Catholic Church and the French state. At that time, assertive seculars had two projects. One project, defended by Prime Minister Émile Combes, was to make the Catholic Church obedient to the state, because for him an independent church would be too dangerous. It should be kept under state authority. But the others, like Briand, they defended more liberal separation. Eventually, Émile Combes' idea was defeated. Even he himself changed his mind. Then France embraced the separation model. But Turkey, I think, after 20 years later, embraced Émile Combes' original idea of keeping Islam under state control by Diyanet. At this point, there is a debate about Diyanet, and recently there was an Abant meeting who proposed making independent a kind of semi-independent institution. And when I interviewed the former president and the current president of Diyanet, they seem to be also prone to accept two transformations. One is to make the budget of Diyanet independent of state budget, and Diyanet will be funded by simply foundations, because at the time of the foundation of the Republic, the Turkish state confiscated the Islamic pious foundations. Now, if they let the Diyanet be funded by them, no need to get money from the state budget. The second thing is appointment. The president now is appointed by the prime minister, and if they have a board of trustees, it can become a semi-independent institution, and it's a solution. Then Diyanet can really become a source of inspiration, because right now, in many Middle Eastern countries, the Islamic institutions are controlled by state and used as a justification of authoritarianism. And the famous or infamous example is Al-Azhar. Since 1960s, the Sheikh of Al-Azhar is a political nominee. The Egyptian president appoints the Sheikh of Al-Azhar. It's very much Diyanet model. So it's already in Middle East, but it's not a good model. Why? Because it makes religion part of authoritarian power structure.
Thank you. Well, no, that is very significant and far-reaching implications for the way Islam is organized, both in Turkey and within the Turkish diaspora, as I think we'll discuss in the next panel. But first, I'd like to open the discussion up to you, the participants in this conference. Please identify yourself and have your question end with a question mark. Thank you. Please.
Yes. Nader Habibi, I'd like to ask a question from Professor Turam. You mentioned urban contestation several times. I was wondering if you can give me a definition of what you mean by that in the context of secular religious.
It's a question about urban contestation.
Correct.
Do I answer now? Okay. So I'm talking on the basis of an ethnography, and I study urban sites of contestation. By that I mean highly divided urban sites over issues relating to Muslim politics. Let me give you an example. University campuses have been deeply divided over the issue of headscarf. So it creates fault lines. People take sites, and they look as these sites, and I handpick them. It's an ethnography, multi-sided ethnography. That means I don't pre-plan the site. I follow the sites as these divides happen. So these sites from outside look as torn sites, deeply divided, very polarized, We hear so much about them, and they're very vocal places. We hear about these, so these are famous places, if you allow me to say. We hear about them a lot in media because there are very famous, scholars, journalists, university students who are getting arrested. So there is voice coming out of it, and it all sounds negative because, what is good about all these woke lines? So I've been looking in these sites for the last 5 years, and I'm arguing that beyond that facade, not facade, they're really arguing, contesting, fighting. Feelings get hurt. It gets sometimes very personal. But beyond all of that, these sites are the specific sites which unite and unify against freedom violations, most vocally. So I'm not generalizing these sites to the entire country. I'm admitting that I handpick these sites and I follow these sites from Turkey to abroad. For example, if I study a highly divided neighborhood in Turkey, I actually follow this neighborhood study to the Turkish neighborhood in Germany, Kreuzberg, and look at the neighborhood politics there. So that this is how it makes it multi-sided, and out of these divided sites, I analyze the patterns of contestation. And one last thing, this kind of contestation I don't see as polarization because it's really happening after the inclusion of the pious Muslims into the sites. In other words, they're actually already progressive because they have already opened up and included them. That's why they're fighting so much anyway. I don't know if this answers you.
Okay. Thank you both for great presentations. I have one question for...
You stand and speak up, thank you.
Thank you for two great presentations. I have one question to Berna and one to Ahmet. Berna, I was really intrigued by your comment in a positive way about the Kemalist approach or the secularist approach and the pious conservative Islamist approach to gender, creating both the same result, that they both want women to participate or to be part of the public sphere without really allowing them room for decision making, I think you said, right? So real empowerment. What would change in Turkey, in your opinion, this gender dilemma? What would create women's empowerment? Do you see any movement beyond the secular Kemalist sphere or the Islamic sphere that would actually trigger something more substantial in terms of gender issues, gender empowerment? And do you see also a similar dynamic in the Kemalist, secularist and Islamic approach to the Kurdish question, creating the same kind of dilemmas that the Kurdish question, which is the most important, urgent question of Turkey? Is there also similarities in the way Kemalists and pious conservatives, Islamists, since we use these terms in a way interchangeably, approach the Kurdish question? And what would create a different approach to the Kurdish question if we don't see any difference in the way Islamists or Kemalists approach the Kurdish issue? And Ahmet, to you, the question about the transition from assertive to passive secularism. When you look at your case studies, what are the elements that create the transition from assertive, radical, militant secularism to more tolerant, more passive secularism? Because there is this transition usually from authoritarian systems to democratization. There's a huge literature on democratization, and it seems to me what gives Turkey really different is that it is a democracy, but still a very illiberal democracy. So aren't we in a way debating the transition from being an illiberal democracy to being a liberal democracy? And what would create, in your opinion, in Turkey, a liberal democracy with this kind of passive secularism? Are we there yet? You mentioned that Turkey is no longer this militant secularism, but what are the elements that would liberalize in the way Turkish democracy in Europe?
Thank you. Were people able to hear in back the questions? Yeah, okay. Professor Kuru, would you please take your question first?
Sure. Thanks for the question. Very important and challenging one. So there are other examples besides Turkey that we see the transformation of assertive secularism or move from assertive to passive. One is Mexico. In 1992, the Catholic Church didn't have legal existence in Mexico. It was a formally illegal church. Then, as part of the late third wave or the following the democratization worldwide after the collapse of Soviet Union, Mexico embraced new amendments and laws and move a bit from assertive to passive. And you are right, it's definitely a part of democratization because it directly coincides with democracy in Mexico. In France, its assertive secularism had much more popular support than it has in Turkey. Therefore, it emerged with multi-party regime. But democratization, especially after the Second World War, resulted in moderation of assertive secularism in France. And when it comes to Catholicism today, it is hard to talk about an assertive French state because right now a fourth of students are going to Catholic schools and all teachers' salary is paid by French state in Catholic schools. There are so many gestures and accommodation. But when it comes to Islam, the French state shows its assertive face again. In Turkey, directly, it's an issue of democratization. You are absolutely right. Why? Because each time the right-wing parties, from Menderes to Demirel, from Demirel to Özal, and Özal from Erdogan now, try to moderate, try to eliminate some restrictions. But military intervention, judicial interventions kept some policies, headscarf ban and discrimination of graduates of imamative schools, or the ban on Quran for students under 15 or 12 years old to learn how to read the Quran. So these are assertive policies against Muslims, but also assertive policies against Christians and Jews in Turkey. The Halkalı Seminary is still closed. And until last year, the property rights of Christian and Jewish foundations were not recognized, at least there were limitations. But what we see in Turkey, the move from assertive to passive secularism is in parallel with democratization. The tutelage, the military tutelage, you call it illiberal democracy, is weakened. Now, 60 out of 360 generals of Turkey are in prison. So the military generals are now touchable, they are no longer untouchable. Then judicial system also changed after 2010 referendum. So now assertive secularists are no longer powerful in Turkey. Therefore, we are seeing some reforms. In terms of Christians and Jews, now the laws change about building temple. There are much more freedom now for them. Then their confiscated properties were given back. There are still things to do like Halkalı Seminary, but big steps forward, reforms are already made. When it comes to freedoms of Muslims, these three issues, headscarf ban, and then imamatives and the Quran courses are still on the way. But I think Berna is right that it is a balance of power thing. But what I see that in the daily life, the problem is minimal. In Turkey, the problem of secularism was at the state level. Therefore, whenever we see democratization, so normally people are tolerant of religious, non-religious things, drinking alcohol or wearing bikini. Within the same family, you see pious people or very secular people together. But the main problem was between politicians and state apparatus. And then democratization will hopefully, in 10 years or so, will solve the problem. But it will not automatically make Turkey a liberal democracy. It's the goal ends. It's much more the deeper thing to reach. But at least in terms of religious freedom, it will be a more free country. But other freedoms, when I emphasize freedom of speech, associations, these are related but independent issues.
Berna Turam?
So, women's issues, gender politics. Is this off? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, that's a very good question. So in my study, this is my first book, I was talking about gender politics in the Gülen movement, arguing that they only adopt the gender politics from the secularist male elite. So I was really looking at the male elite. I mean, it's kind of like masculinity studies almost. I didn't really study the women, or the argument doesn't come from the study of the woman. Later on, I looked at the woman more carefully in the movement and JDP. So here's the issue. As Yeşil Murat clearly argued many decades ago, yes, Atatürk handpicked women and inserted them into the parliament, and these women were not empowered, they weren't given the power to make decisions, but Turkish women, the secular Turkish women, later on took the advantage of those positions in the parliament and in the public sphere and created their own movement. So Turkey has a strong feminist secular movement. It actually happened. What is not happening so far is a strong Islamic feminist movement, and it actually almost appeared, again, Yeşil Murat studied it during the time of the welfare party in 1990s, when the welfare gave some breathing space to women where they could develop their own feminist movement, and then JDP undermined it entirely. So what we see right now is that we have this Gülen movement and the JDP, which kind of resemble each other in terms of the absence of a strong Islamic feminist movement. But this is not surprising at all, because they both are conservative religious parties. They're not radical, they're not militant, they're not revolutionary. And we know in feminist literature that only revolutionary radical movements incorporate women because they need the woman to overthrow the regime or to make a real change. So in this setting in Turkey, when we look at the pious, they're happy with the status quo. They're very happy to keep women in their place in their traditional roles. Well, so the move that the secularist women did in Turkey is not really coming out. And I call this politics of non-resistance. You cannot force women to organize. I mean, so far, I don't see much interest, especially in the Gülen movement, to organize a women's movement. JDP is a little bit ahead of time because the same people who organize in the Welfare Party for women's rights are still alive, but just a little bit silenced. What I'm trying to say, Ömer, is that by looking at the male elite, we cannot really expect a change in terms of women's equality. Women have to do it for themselves. And the picture right now in Turkey is that the secularist women and the pious Muslim women have very little platform to cooperate for a very efficient women's organization movement. This is unfortunate. They have different ways of doing politics. Non-resistance versus aggressive Kemalist feminists. They don't see the world similarly. One likes submission because of submission to God. The other one is aggressive and increasingly bitter because they're thinking everything they did in their life in terms of feminism is melting into the air. And that creates a gap. So the less differences there are between the seculars and pious women in Turkey in terms of education, money, lifestyle, the more similar they are, the less cooperative they became. And that's not the good ground to organize a strong feminist movement. So we need work there. I've been part of some feminist groups that really try to bring all women from all these identity groups together, including Armenians, Kurds. It's not working. I mean, I can tell you more later. It's just simply not working because of very divisive identity politics. Now, I'm jumping to the Kurdish issue, the same problem. The pious Muslims and the secularists, they're actually so similar they're not realizing it, but they have different ways of doing politics sometimes. The only missing thing is, in order to push freedoms in Turkey, whether it's freedom of religion, like in your question it was the Diyanet, or whether it's freedom of women or Kurds, we have a pending freedom issue because the liberals of this country, the actual political liberals, not neoliberals, politically liberal people who care about individual freedom, freedom of expression, they cannot find any party to vote in Turkey, yet they're too busy and too indifferent to lobby, mobilize, or form their own party. So the liberal voice gets lost. It's not heard. They only complain and bitch about things, but they don't do anything actually. So we're left with this out-of-date rift between the old Kemalists and the new Islamists. They're not interested in freedoms. That's their least concern. I mean, 301 has been sitting there forever. No one cares. So in terms of the Kurdish problem, we really need liberal Democrats to be involved in politics. That's why I'm starting to look at the international community now, because the West is not really producing itself within Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Well, actually, more than that. I'm going to start with Professor Ali Banwazizi, and then I'm going to actually gather the last three and ask you to just be brief as possible. Thank you.
First of all, many thanks for two wonderful presentations. One question. You talked about the political and social dynamics of the democratization and the many ways in which Turkey is exceptional. I wonder if you would comment on the economic dimension of this and the many ways in which the relatively liberal and free market economy that thrived in Turkey in the 1980s and 90s contributed to this democratization and provided a foundation for it. Obviously, in your analysis of the Rentier state, you implicitly, I think, referred to it. But I wonder if you would comment on it a little bit more in detail.
Thanks. A question from the over here. Yes.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. My name is Faisal Farsa. I'm recently qualified at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard. I'm Danish citizen. Denmark is, if you character Denmark is not a secular state. It is established religion and no separation between church and state. But it is a deeply democratically run country. And I'm thinking it's maybe we should notice much more about the culture of democracy that has been in this country for centuries. So it is it's not just a formal separation, but what is actually is being I think as you mentioned about the really emphasize on the individual freedom is legal freedom is enormous.
Thank you. The gentleman in the second row.
Turgay Ertur. Let me ask my question first. What do you think about the future of Imam Hatip high schools? These people, in last time also, the cause fist fight in the parliament, this 14 to 17 years age. 14 years person is 8th grade, so high school 2nd grade. Now, these people don't know English, don't know world, don't study other religions. How could they be a mature contributor to the society in terms of having a tie or the peace between secularists and religious people? These schools were proliferated in 1982. So, in my opinion, a good progress in Turkey when Turkey takes religious education to higher education, so that people become open-minded, become able to question things, so that they could contribute to the society better than a high school student.
Okay, I think we get the gist of it. Thank you very much. And there was one last question. I just asked to be brief. Thank you. Yes, you, sir.
My question is similar to the last one. My question is to Berna Turam, and I wonder how can we evaluate the place of education system in Turkey in terms of democracy culture, and in terms of its impact on Turkish democracy in the future. As a Turkish citizen, I haven't seen a mature system teaching kind of liberal thinking and also tolerance to differentiating from each other in Turkey so far, be it at secondary school levels, be it Imam Hatip or other secular schools, or be it at college level education.
Thank you. These are four superb questions that I know deserve so much more time than we're able to give them. I'm just going to ask you to be as brief as possible, maybe answer in just about 3 minutes each, just to stay on schedule. Thanks.
Oh, okay. I think Ahmet has more questions, so I will just engage with the culture of democracy, the Danish question, and the education. culture of democracy, political culture. Well, I actually did some field work in Denmark on the Gülen schools 10 years ago. Yes, it is a democracy and it's liberal, but when we discuss Muslims in Europe, do the same freedoms and rights apply to the Muslims? I mean, there's a serious Islamophobia, and when I was conducting research in Denmark, this is before the crisis of Muhammad's caricatures, basically every Muslim, and the largest Muslim majority is Turkish, told me that the Danish state's official ideology is to make good Danes out of Turks. So, what I'm trying to say is, liberal democracies are sometimes only liberal to their own religious majority. Muslims in Europe are actually complaining, in almost all countries, but specifically in France, Germany, Denmark, in Holland, about discrimination in non-recognition for their rights and freedoms. And these countries have proven almost equally unsuccessful in accommodating Muslim minorities. So when I apply this to the culture of democracy, political culture in Turkey, the same issue. This is identity politics, which is very divisive. When we discuss freedoms in Turkey, it's always in the form of this: freedom for the headscarfed women, freedom for the women who don't cover their heads, freedom for the Kurds, freedom for Armenians. No, because liberal democracy and the real democrat cares for liberties of everybody, not just one group or not just for himself. And that's the weak aspect in both European countries and Turkey currently. I think we share a lot of problems, by the way, in terms of Muslim accommodation. Reform is needed. And the second question about place of education in democracy, yes, liberal thinking in Turkish education is a crying game. It's a burning problem, but I can't see the who asked it. But there is this issue. Even in academia, not just high schools, in Western countries, there is this new trend that Enlightenment thinking liberalism is just not being taught well anymore. I know there are other trendy, fashionable approaches: post-colonialism, identity politics, deconstructivism, and there is this point where almost liberal stands for neoliberal, and it has a bad connotation. We are so lazy to differentiate politically liberal from neoliberal and defend it by using Enlightenment thinkers' ideas about individual freedom. So in terms of education, yes, Turkish education system needs a lot of reform, but I see similar trends in the United States. Freedoms have been not only agenda for so long, and the security states, United States, Israel, and Turkey mainly, are just creating these measures against alleged terrorist activities, and this actually requires more attention on freedoms now, especially now. I don't know if this answers your question.
Thank you, Berna Turam. Yes,
so 3 questions, thanks for each of them, starting with free market. Yes, you are right, it's an important dimension of democratization in Turkey, but it's related to the 2 factors I mentioned. One is ties with Western institutions. Turkey has already been part of European Customs Union for about 10 years or so. And the second thing is the taxation-based economy rather than oil-based economy, which is another incentive for Turkish politicians to move from import-substitute economy to export-oriented economy. The second issue about Imam Hatibs and other schools, yes, Turkey has an education problem. The school system needs to be reformed. And it doesn't matter whether it's a religious-based school or more secular school, the quality is important, the content of it important. And you can teach religion with more emphasis on questioning. Or you can teach secularism in a very dogmatic way. So the content and style is important. So every day students are reciting a pledge today in Turkey, and the pledge is extremely nationalistic. It may be updated and revised, if not abolished. So, and even in non-religious secular schools, they don't teach English well. They only know, my name is Ahmet. So, it's a joke. So the last one is that the formal constitutional design is important. Yes, Denmark is an established church state, but it's a democracy. It shows that secularism is not necessary or sufficient condition. But the culture, yes, democracy is a culture, but there are always some borders and limitations. Think of Switzerland. I thought Switzerland was a very democratic country with democratic culture, but they banned minarets, despite the fact that there were only 4 minarets in Switzerland. They banned it by referendum. It wasn't a parliamentary decision. So we show the borders of European democratic culture there. And if we compare United States and Britain, we see the importance of formality, because we have a First Amendment here based on which the Supreme Court struck down the Bible reading and prayer. But in Britain, they don't have this. They have established, therefore they can recite prayer, Lord's Prayer and Bible reading in British schools, therefore laws matter.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panel.